Well, good morning and welcome, everybody. My name's Tom Lyon. I'm the Dow Chair of Sustainable Science, Technology, and Commerce at the University of Michigan, where I hold appointments in both the Ross School of Business and the School of Environment and Sustainability. I also have the honor of serving as the faculty director of our Urb Institute for Global Sustainable Enterprise, which is one of the hosts of this event. Our mission as an institute is to create a sustainable world through harnessing the power of business. And we do that through our educational programs, our faculty research, and our business engagement. In 2018, I wrote an article in California Management Review entitled CSR Needs CPR, Corporate Sustainability and Politics, which was chosen as the journal's best article of the year. Based on that article, in 2020, the Institute created the Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force to help companies address the growing demands for business to engage in responsible political advocacy on climate change, social justice, and protecting democracy. I am delighted to be introducing today's session with Chief Justice Leo Strine. We're deeply appreciative of the efforts of our co-hosts to help bring this special event together. Let me just share some brief headlines on the dedicated leaders and organizations who will join the dialogue today. Preventable Surprises, led by CEO Jerome Tagger, is a group of industry insiders working with institutional investors to mitigate systemic risks like climate change. Among its priorities, Preventable Surprises works specifically on the role of investors with regard to corporate policy capture. American Promise, led by former Massachusetts Assistant Attorney General Jeff Clements, is a national cross-partisan group working on a constitutional amendment to reflect bipartisan American majorities who want limits on political spending. In This Together America, co-founded by San Francisco Republican Bill Shireman, focuses on empowering problem solvers across the political spectrum to collaborate on solutions to climate change, distrust, and hate. In addition to these presenting co-hosts, we're grateful for the support of three pioneering organizations. The Center for Political Accountability, led by Bruce Freed, produces the annual CPA Zicklin Index and has almost single-handedly established political spending disclosure and oversight as a best practice among the S&P 500. Business for America, led by former Apple executive Sarah Bonk, is a nonpartisan business alliance focused on civic health through increasing civic participation, reducing distrust and polarization, and supporting nonpartisan reforms. The Leadership Now project, led by Daniela Balu-Ayers, is a national network of business and thought leaders who are taking action to fix American democracy, including principles-based reforms and campaigns. With that, let me turn things over to my co-host, Jerome Tagger. Jerome.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the excellent introduction. We're delighted to be here and as Preventable Surprises co-hosting this conversation, but I'm perhaps even more delighted to introduce Elizabeth Doty, who will be our moderator today. And Elizabeth has been a guide and a thought leader for us as we ventured into this space. Elizabeth is the director of the Urb Institute's Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force at the University of Michigan. For 30 years, Elizabeth has worked to increase the positive impact of business in society with a particular focus on business's influence on civic and political affairs. From 2012 to 2015, she served as a fellow in Lawrence Lessig's lab on institutional corruption at the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, where her research focused on keeping corporate promises to stakeholders and earned her recognition as a national thought leader in trust. During interviews for her book, The Compromise Trap, Elizabeth first learned about the tensions employees face when their company's political influences do not align with their values, and how some were helping their companies increase alignment. Elizabeth's firm leadership momentum has worked with companies in over a dozen industries, and she's a top columnist with Strategy Plus Business magazine. She earned her MBA from Harvard Business School in 1991 and is active on the advisory boards of American Promise and Business for America, who are among our co-hosts today. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerome. And I've so enjoyed our conversations over the past, I think it's been about 3 years. I'm so excited to be here today and really grateful for the combination of thinkers and speakers and doers that will be in the conversation today. And we're so fortunate to have former Chief Justice Leo Strine with us today. I will say right now, we have been trying to work out how to refer to His Honor, His Excellency, Chief, Chancellor, etc. So we've decided to put his title as CEO of the Hair Club for Men. And you will hear me refer to Leo or Chief as we go through. So, and that will set the tone for the kind of conversation we hope we have. We also, we're going to have, I'm very excited to have Professor Dorothy Lund join us today, as she is the co-author of the article that inspired today's conversation in Harvard Business Review in January, February, Corporate Political Spending is Bad for Business, How to Reduce Risks and Focus on What Counts. But she has had to bow out of today's conversation due to an unavoidable conflict, and I can tell you it's for the best of reasons, but I won't go into her personal situation to say any more than that. So we'll miss her today, and I think Leo and I will try and carry the flow of the core interview without her. The conversation will go in 2 rounds. I will ask some questions of Leo, Chief Justice, and we will explore a topic first around the problem, turn to some comments from our co-hosts, and then turn for a couple of questions or comments from all of you, and then go back to actions and solutions and do the same thing. And then we can stay after to have the informal conversation after the call. So for whoever has the time to stay on, you're most welcome, and we will do that. But first, let me introduce former Chief Justice Leo Strine. And this may take me a couple minutes, but it's important to set some context for what we're going to discuss today. Leo Strine is of counsel in the corporate department of Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, and the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court. Prior to his tenure as Chief Justice, he served as the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor in Delaware's Court of Chancery, the nation's leading court for corporate law, as over 60% of the Fortune 500 are incorporated in the state of Delaware. He has, in that role and in those roles, has shaped the legal landscape and is widely considered to be one of the most influential judges in the history of corporate law in America. He has authored numerous landmark opinions that have helped shape many key facets of modern business law in areas like corporate governance, fiduciary duty, and mergers and acquisitions. He's a member of the American Law Institute and currently serves as an advisor on a project to create a restatement of corporate law. So really, we couldn't be talking to someone who knew more. As a renowned legal scholar, he's one of the most cited authors in his field, and scores of articles on business and public law topics have appeared frequently in prominent journals and university law reviews, including the Columbia Law Review, Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and on several occasions, those articles were selected as among the best corporate and securities articles of the year. For a generation, he taught various corporate law courses at the Harvard and University of Pennsylvania law schools. He's refocusing right now. He now serves as the Michael L. Wachter Distinguished Fellow in Law and Policy at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School, and a Senior Fellow in the Harvard Program on Corporate Governance. He has also been called the most charismatic figure in the world of corporate law. I don't know how big a field that is for charisma, sprinkling references to music and pop culture in his opinions and proceedings, and showing a certain irreverence for the traditional view of suspenders. I'll let him explain that. And as I said, we can refer to him as Chief, Chancellor, Leo, or CEO of the Hair Club. So Leo, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. In a moment, I'll get to my first question of you, but just first, thank you for making the time.
No, I'm glad to be here. I'm a big supporter of President Biden, given that he was my senator for many years, and we had Senator Bill Roth. President Biden, I thought we call Build Back Better what we already passed, which is infrastructure, then heal the nation, bipartisan commitment, grow back better, which is to cure male pattern baldness. I think it starts to knit the nation together, and then we get into this corporate political spending thing, which is also a bipartisan consensus when you look at the polls, Elizabeth. So sorry for the interruption. I didn't mean to be rude to him, but he was banging on the back door earlier. Now he's banging on the front door. And
Never mind.
yes.
Thank you.
Realize-
And that reminds me of a couple of situations where companies needed to do software updates in the middle of something. So
Yes.
thank you. And I will say our commitment today is to look at solutions that go beyond partisan divides and to take a problem-solving, constructive view. So I'm really glad that you identified the hair regrowth as a cross-partisan issue, and that's.
I think it is. I mean, I don't think we should just grow it back for one party or leave out the independents. I think it should be something, it's a form of universal thing, and it's something that would knit us together in the nation and eliminate the need for comb-overs.
I think we should actually have a poll at the end on that. But first, we'll talk about the serious stuff. So I want to focus. This article in Harvard Business Review comes right out and says corporate political spending is bad for business, and that is often framed as differently from that. It's often framed as political spending by business is good for shareholders, but may be harmful to other stakeholders. And you and Professor Lund just tackled that head on and said, no, it's bad for business. And you framed it in light of a legitimacy issue. And so I thought most people haven't thought about this as much as you have. Maybe you can frame up for us why you think there's a legitimacy question there, and maybe a little historical context on your claim that political spending is bad for business.
Yeah, I mean, the legitimacy argument is pretty simple, which is, no one invests money in corporations as an expression of their political beliefs. And this is not a liberal view. This was a shared bipartisan view. In fact, the people most concerned about corporate political involvement, in the 1950s and 60s were people on the right who feared that corporations were in conspiracy with liberals to essentially run society. And they were right about one thing, which is people don't invest in ExxonMobil, General Motors, IBM, Google, as an expression of their political beliefs. And that intuition is actually growing stronger because we've gotten rid of defined benefit pension plans. We've asked Americans to save for their retirement. You were basically given a range of choices by your employer, typically mutual funds. You don't have control over them. The mutual funds themselves, Elizabeth, don't know what to do because they know they have money from Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And the companies don't get the money for that reason. And corporate boards are not representative of anyone except equity investors. And equity investors don't vote on these issues. And so there's no way for a corporation to figure out legitimately how to give money. And that's why the political process had a bipartisan consensus about this, right? Which is that corporations could not give donations out of treasury funds. And that to the extent that they wanted to get involved in the political process, they should get involved through a PAC. And the PAC could only specifically raise funds, only spend specifically raised funds that were voluntarily donated by stockholders or employees. And so the legitimacy problem for the corporation is pretty obvious, that who gave them the money to pour into our politics? No one did. Their investors don't invest for this reason. They're not particularly representative of the electorate. And we have some, basic statistics in our article, and it's not unexpected, for example, that corporate executives and board members are more likely to be wealthy than the typical American. They're much more likely to be Republican than the ordinary American. That more Americans are, frankly, increasingly more Americans are independents than a member of either party. And that there's really no way to reconcile these issues. So that is the sort of basic legitimacy question. And one of the problems too is there's intermediaries, the stockholders are actually not directly Americans anymore. They're these institutional investors who have the same problem. Nobody picks the S&P 500 fund of BlackRock or Vanguard or Fidelity because of politics. And by the way, you may not get to choose among those funds. You basically will get, your employer picks a fund family, and you could do the dividend momentum fund, the social responsibility fund, or whatever. And you can't take it out until I'm not even old enough, class, as bad as I look, I'm still too young to take money out of my 401k without a tax penalty. And so that's the basic issue. And, we can get aside from the other thing is that human beings are not interested in just one thing, right? What I mean is they're not just interested in the profitability of one company.
Mm-hmm.
And they pay taxes, and shifting costs from a corporation to society hits you in your tax. They also are investors in debt, not just stock. They breathe air, they consume products, and they, as we'll talk about, they often own proxies for the entire economy, Elizabeth. So that the idea that a single corporation engaging in rent seeking in the political process, that makes that company more profitable, but to the detriment of conduct overall in the industry that externalizes costs, and to the detriment of workers, to the detriment of consumers, to the detriment of the environment, or that creates an overall economic system where the focus is, as my friend John Coates was, and he said this before Ukraine, well before, was the risk of becoming Russia, which is where people don't compete on the quality of products and services, but they compete on rent seeking and who knows government. That the sum total of that is not a more wealthy American economy over time. It's one that's skewed, and the sum total of each industry's rent seeking is actually a dead weight cost to real economic growth in America. So that's in short the basic legitimacy problem, that they don't hold this money for that purpose. There aren't constraints on it. And that's why it's almost impossible for businesses as well. We'll talk about why it's not good for business, Elizabeth. When you're in that condition, in that position, it's very difficult to hold your head high and to walk forward in a way where you can say that you're actually being true to your mission, and that you're not dishonoring some stakeholder, because there's really no way to reconcile this, because Americans are fundamentally, it's part of our freedom, entitled to have different views about key political issues. That's the magic, right? That we come together to peaceably govern ourselves, but we're allowed to disagree. And when you hold a bunch of people's money, and it's not because they agree and want to speak through you, then if you pursue one vision of the good, you're almost by definition subordinating others and making them feel less. And you're delegitimizing yourself in the eyes of someone. And if you try to reconcile them all, it's almost impossible. Because if you have Thanksgiving dinner with your family, try to reconcile all that, right? And imagine being at the head of the table where you're just going to take everybody's wealth and you're going to be the one who spends it on politics. It's bad enough when you just talk it out, right? It's best to stick to less controversial issues like who should be MVP in the NBA this year than it is to talk politics. But imagine if one member of the family just got to essentially say how it goes. It doesn't go so well. It's not very much American, and that's the basic problem that the corporations face.
So that, to me, thank you for that. And what I'm hearing you say, on the one hand, is a challenge to current thinking, but also maybe a diagnosis of some of the symptoms that companies are dealing with right now, in being attacked for taking one position here and not taking another position there, and spending here and lobbying there and saying this here, that you're saying it's not possible to reconcile that. And yet they're in the position to have to. When did that happen? How did we get to where we're depending so much on companies to be the mediating, head of the table, trying to represent all?
I think we're getting there because companies themselves ask for it. The business community writ large has, went to war on the New Deal, Great Society consensus. Business money has been poured into a lot of the causes that have gone after environmental regulation, and even gone and undermined campaign finance regulation. And so you have a situation where it's not enough to pass the Affordable Care Act. And it's not enough that the Affordable Care Act was obviously constitutional by, if you could bring Chief Justice Rehnquist back to life, or Chief Justice Berger, neither of whose political views I shared, that would not have been a hard case on any ground, and they would have sustained it. McCain-Feingold would probably not have been a hard case. The Voting Rights Act had been extended 98-2. Mm-hmm. And so all of these efforts have, to undermine societal regulation have been aided and abetted by elements of the business community. And then when you have Citizens United and you take away from Congress and state legislatures the ability to regulate campaign finance, Elizabeth, you only have two options, and we'll talk about some of them. One is to go and try to pass a constitutional amendment, and we know how difficult that is. And the other is to say, okay, these folks don't really understand corporate law. They've taken it out of Congress's hands. But those of us who understand corporate law know that you can require that certain subjects be addressed with approval of the stockholders. And Jack Bogle, a legend and a genuine American in the true sense of someone who embodied our shared principles, his immediate reaction to Citizens United was 75% vote required for corporations to spend money on politics. Why so high, Mr. Bogle? The answer is, like we talked about, no one gives money to these corporations, and certainly we at Vanguard don't give our money to corporations because they share our political beliefs, or we pretend that our investors have to have shared beliefs. That's un-American. So if these companies want to spend it, there ought to be a supermajority that demonstrates a genuine consensus that the corporation can spend consistent with this plan. And I think some people ask you, does that mean, do you think these votes are likely to win? And his point was, no, they're probably not likely to win. And doesn't that prove the point? And then maybe you leave the political process in terms of spending to ordinary Americans. And if stockholders want to give their money to ExxonMobil or to Apple or to Walmart to spend in the political process, they can. But class, I'll tell you this, they had that option, right? Elizabeth, they had that option for years to go to stockholders. They never raised a dime for stockholders.
Yeah.
And think about writing the letter. Dear stockholders of ExxonMobil, you love the company. And so what we'd like you to do is, rather than give money to charity or your own favorite political candidates, send us in some cash so that we can spend it as we choose in the political process. Signed, CEO and board of directors of ExxonMobil or Walmart or Salesforce. Now, I don't know, I like to think your CEOs and your boards are smart enough to not walk knowingly into helicopter blades. And so their very failure to take this option demonstrates the legitimacy problem, Elizabeth. But that's why we're in two realms right now. We're either in the realm of the really high bar of trying to get a constitutional amendment. And also, by the way, that is impeded itself by corporate spending. And so one of the things is you have to overcome the corporate spending to amend the Constitution, or you look within toolkit of corporate law and have Congress or the states start to say, frankly, if you want to do this, then you have to have the legitimacy at least of a vote from your stockholders.
Gotcha. It's very interesting. And I think you're pointing to some pivotal changes in law and practice over the past 20, 30, 40 years that now seem so normal. And few of us have the time to take stock. So I'd like to turn now to Jerome Tagger with Preventable Surprises, because Jerome, just asking you to add a comment from the investor perspective. And Leo has mentioned several ways that this could be a problem, right? With one company's profits at the expense of the overall economy. And you've been studying this. So can you just share a little of what you're finding as you research whether investor interests are affected by corporate political spending or being a vehicle for spending?
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Chief Justice is a tough act to follow. I was listening and all this time thinking, I hope I don't mumble, I hope I don't mumble, I hope I don't mumble. So bear with me. But what you framed, and our work is global at Preventable Surprises. We don't work just in the US, we engage with institutional investors all over the world. But the issues you framed are relevant globally. And I think there's what we see is that we have competing social concerns. The concerns of everyone's concerns about saving for retirement, for getting their kids through school, or other concerns, and the ones of the polity of society. And those are end up living and breathing in the behavior and choices, and sometimes non-choices of institutional investors. In our work, we look at big systemic issues like climate change, like big tech and democracy, for example, and others, and trying to think, how do the concerns of investors, how do those broadly framed ESG concerns, how do these evolve? How do they how are they primarily portfolio concerns versus political concerns, I guess is the right way to frame it. And we've encouraged investors to look beyond individual companies to say, here's the broader political context, here's the broader policy context in which you operate and in which those decisions or those concerns that you have materialize. And we looked at a range of sectors, and we in fact published a scorecard of the world's largest 50 asset managers by AUM to look at whether they had any consistency in their approach and practices. And the answer is none. We have seen emerging concerns specifically on climate change, where some investors have started to create standards to address lobbying on climate change. We have seen, particularly in the US, a growing movement around political spending, of course, and that's very lively, and there's a few leaders on this topic on this call as well. But it seemed to us that the investors' understanding starts from a low point, from a low basis, and that we've got our work cut out to increase that understanding. And we felt that it is important also to not just talk in terms of principles and ideas, but also look at specifically how the sausage, the proverbial sausage is made. And that's exactly what we're doing here. From our global standpoint, the US is particularly important. It's important because, in global economics and affairs, it's what we might call an overmighty subject. And within this overmighty subject, there's also a group of pretty overmighty subjects as well, which is the index fund industry, which controls significant chunks of the global economy and therefore has significant influence on political processes. And so very glad to be here and to hear this because you're really putting the finger and the accent on very practical ways to address these concerns, and I hope investors hear us.
Thank you very much, Jerome. And this idea that the index funds and these others themselves are major players in the political process, as well as looking at how political influence might affect the entire industry or the entire economy. And I think maybe the most obvious example of what you're talking about is addressing climate change or a price on carbon. Right, and that will hurt all of us, but individual companies may not have the interest in lobbying for it. Let me turn now to Tom Lyon. Tom, there are so many ways you could come in here, but I think one of the most interesting was our pre-conversations about changes in corporate political rights. And maybe I could open it to you to talk to Leo about some of what you've been thinking or asking about that.
Yeah, this will lead up to a question, actually. So I've been reading Adam Winkler's wonderful book, We the Corporations, which gives a remarkably riveting account of how corporations have fought since the beginning of the United States to gain political rights. And I should say, Winkler did an expert dialogue with us earlier this year. It was great. It's been very surprising to me in some ways, because he shows that when the courts have treated corporations as persons in their own right, that often leads counterintuitively to limitations on those political rights. I think most Americans take exactly the opposite perspective and assume allowing corporations to be treated as persons gives them too much power. Now, Winkler refers to you, Justice Strine, as the most influential and charismatic figure in the world of corporate law. He also points out that you once said in relation to the Citizens United decision that the Supreme Court doesn't know much corporate law. So my question for you is, can you just concisely point to where has the court gone wrong in expanding corporate political rights?
Where it went wrong, Tom, is that corporations, academics love to come up with labels, as you know, Tom, for things. And we have things like a corporation is a nexus of contracts. Yeah. That's in no statute in the United States. And if you had said that to James Madison or Chief Justice Marshall or Lincoln, it was nexus of contracts. Where did you fail at? I mean, where are you at? I mean, and there's actually good work by Professor Bowie of Harvard that actually shows that corporate law statutes were in many ways inspired from the charters given to American colonies. And there's a tool from direct democracy and Republican democracy. So one of the basic things from the very beginning is that corporations are a creature of society and they only have the powers that are given to them. It's always been difficult, right? There are human beings inside corporations. And if you allow business entities to go, Tom, and then you can just, because somebody's in a corporation, override all their rights, you know, that may not really work given that we're a commercial nation. But from the beginning of so-called general chartering of corporations, and class, what that means is moving from the legislature specifically chartering every corporation to the legislature, there's a statute where you could pick up things. At the very beginning of these things taking off, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Roscoe Pound, I mean, and his political advisors focused on constraining corporate political spending, because by definition, corporations have a lot of money. They're not representative human beings, and they have a lot of money. And so the idea was to try to leave politics to society. The other corporate law notion is the whole trope over, especially until institutional investors got strong, is that stockholders vote on very particular things, Tom. They vote on things like mergers, changes to the corporate charter. But most things are left to the strong hand of management, subject to just loose review by the courts for compliance with fiduciary duties. And the concern has always been that centralized management has too much authority, like the good Adolph's book, Adolph Early, a prominent New Dealer. And so corporate political spending is something that, how would you monitor this kind of thing as a stockholder? And it just doesn't, it isn't the sort of thing that you would ever think would be effectively governed by stockholders. And frankly, it never had to be, Tom. And that's the other thing with Citizens United is they're acting like corporate law should have anticipated a problem created by the US Supreme Court itself. What I mean, too many adventurous judges they append settled understandings of the relationship of some entity or some segment of society to the polity, and they invent, and that's, I have an article called Originalist or Original, like a novelist, because what Citizens United did was discovered a relationship of the corporation and a freedom of the corporation that no one before Citizens United understood to be true, that corporate law scholars never understood that corporations could do this. And it then said that, frankly, corporations are basically modes of association, that everyone, you know, buys a share, and that if you don't want to do it, you know, you just sort of exercise your powers. But the other thing they do, Tom, is they actually don't even understand the fundamentals. In like things like Hobby Lobby, they act like a founding family is the board of directors or something, right? They don't even really understand corporate law in terms of the mode of decision making. And so there's just, and John Macy and I at Yale, and John and I don't have identical views on politics. But again, we have a bipartisan consensus on this, that this is just not the way corporate law ever saw things working, that this new understanding is something that the Supreme Court did. And by the way, Tom, this whole idea that you're an association and therefore you're kind of stuck with whatever the centralized authority does, they don't apply that to labor unions. And I would argue that labor unions are much more an expression of authentic association than buying a share of stock. And the labor unions, they made play by their own order. They said you could only give money that was specifically designated by a union member. And so, and all McCain-Feingold did, Tom, was basically say that that's the same for corporations. You could raise the money voluntarily from your employees. You could raise it voluntarily from the stockholders. When you did that, you could spend that money in unlimited sums and independent expenditures. Then what the Supreme Court comes around and says, no, actually there's this right of whoever's in charge of the corporation to use these funds, any funds in the Treasury, for political purposes. It's and by the way, Congress, it's a First Amendment violation if you tell them no. And that's what I'm saying. There's just so much wrong with this. And when you read the decisions, they really don't look at corporate law statutes. They all pick and choose sort of academic theories, and they don't deal with the actual realities of corporate law. And they also don't deal with, because they try to come from some originalist perspective. And that's why I say original like a novelist. I'm sorry, but Chief Justice Marshall was closer to the founding than you guys. And so was Madison, and so were others. And for-profit corporations that were generally chartered didn't even exist at the time of the founding. And if the notion had been when you went to general chartering is that they got to do whatever they wanted in the political process, I don't think they would have been given that. But no one ever thought that. And that's the problem with otherworldly people looking back in time, making up their own theories. And then they take it out, and I'll finish time, I'll repeat because I want to get to the great solutions you all have been discussing, but they basically took it out of the most legitimate hands to govern corporate, political spending, which would be the Congress and state legislators, by basically making it impossible for them to do their job because they've created a First Amendment right for artificial entities that are created by the state.
Where the rights are determined through the law rather than as a matter of the Constitution. I am looking at the time you're on. I want to make sure we do get to the questions. So thank you, Tom, and thank you, Leo, for the history. I think this is really important to put this in historical context and to see what has changed as leaders now are dealing with the current reality. But I'm going to ask Zach and Adam, I'm going to ask you to note the questions that are coming through, but I want to keep us going to the solutions and action options, because I think these are really provocative and we want to make sure we have time for them. So if you could do that for me, I'd appreciate it. So this second question here is now, you say we can go to the really difficult question of a constitutional amendment, and we actually have folks on the call who will speak to that, or we can work within corporate law to really clean up this legitimacy issue and the way it sets up hypocrisy traps for companies. And you outline 3 ways that current corporate law could be used. And John Bogle is one of your inspirations. Could you walk through the 3 that are in the article and why you think they will help?
Yeah, I mean, I think for corporate leaders themselves, I think the best approach for a company is to just simply stop making expenditures out of the corporation. It doesn't mean your CEO can't spend his own money, your CFO, but I think you'd be better off just not making political expenditures. If you want to be heard by governors, you don't have to give to the RGA or the DGA. You can give to the National Governors Association and foster bipartisan efforts. If you want to be heard by state legislators, you don't have to give to the Republicans or the Democrats. You can give to the National Conference of State Legislators. Same is true in attorney generals. So you can support the institutions and bipartisan learning and be heard. The other thing about corporations is I had not known. I worked for many years, the great governor of Delaware, now our senior senator. You don't have to call him up. If Senator Carper has not heard from you as a major employer in Delaware, you're going to hear from him. And he's going to ask you what's on your mind. What can we do to help? Are the things we should know about? If you have jobs in the community, you will be heard on the basis of that. And your lobbyists will be heard. And by the way, if the only way you can get heard is by pouring your money in, then think about what that means for our society. And if the only way you're succeeding is by people who really aren't in states where you do anything, but they're carrying water for you, that's kind of creepy and weird. So I think the best of all is to just try to stay out of it. Doesn't mean you don't use your voice, but you don't use dollars. You're legitimately heard over your issues. I think if you're going to spend, again, go back to McCain-Feingold, work through a PAC, only spend money that you're voluntarily raised. But even then, I think you would do yourself well to have a process. And I think you can't just give to every member of the committees that regulate you. That's what's hit some good companies now in Florida. That's hit people in Texas. Because if you give to everybody, frankly, they vote on a whole range of deals. So I think if you're going to do that, you need to have a say, what are our values as a company? What are the things we're really true to? And if we're going to give, we need to make sure that these folks that we give to or causes we give to are consistent with all of our beliefs, and that we're not simply giving to rent seek in our particular thing. That's difficult. But if you're going to do it, at least has more legitimacy. And then I would say, honestly, if you get approval, Elizabeth, if you're going to do this, if you'd actually put out how you're going to do it and get stockholder approval, and also be open about it, which is any money we spend, you're going to know about. be good. And here's the other thing, when you do these things, the corporations love the old rule, Elizabeth, because if you could not say no, you had a good answer and no one would ask you. Part of what Citizens United did was open up businesses to being importuned by all comers and finding it well, Leo, you're trying to say no, but Sarah, who's running a corporation in our industry, they just authorized $1 million check to our association. So I guess you just don't value us.
And you invite retaliation.
Well, and yes, and people need merger approvals. They need other kinds of things. And so part of why the old rules were good for business is if you couldn't say yes, you had a good answer and they wouldn't ask you. But those are some of the basic tools and they're in the article. And if the article hasn't been distributed, Elizabeth, I'm sure you guys can get it around to folks.
Yeah, it was distributed as a pre-reading and the link will be posted at the end. So I think this is really interesting. So what is the objection? Is it a transition problem of, making the decision to shift? Because right now there are only
unilateral disarmament is a concern.
Okay.
A friend of mine at Harvard who's on a board, his view that in his industry, he represents a small players, which are like independent suppliers of parts in an industry that are part makers that are not the big players. And I mean, they're not the people who make the actual product, but they're good for consumers because they're competitive products and they're cheaper. And that if they just give up spending, the big boys and girls will continue to spend. I think the other thing is, companies hire lobbyists and people on K Street or the equivalent of K Street in Austin or Springfield, or, pick your state capital, Tallahassee, that the playbook has become for people who want to influence government is not to do the hard work as much as let's write some checks. And so you get that sort of thing. And there's a first mover problem. I mean, people just don't want to necessarily be out there. And so I think it's getting some leadership, some people to set some tone at the top. I think you already got with Bruce's leadership and different things, there's more and more pressure on disclosure. As you get more disclosure, Elizabeth, and I'll let other people talk to this, when you get disclosure, the problems I'm talking about of being unable to do this, even if you try, because when you give, like when you're a telecom and you give to your committee, they're not going to be just Democrats or Republicans. They're not going to just vote on telecom. And they may just have views that really are quite inconsistent with your stated values in terms of how you treat your employees or other things. And when it comes out that you're giving money to them, it can be kind of embarrassing. Like, for example, companies that gave to someone who thought it was kind of cute to dress as a Confederate soldier, so it's kind of a little embarrassing. But when the only reason they gave to her was because she was on the committee of jurisdiction that affected their company. And that's the problem, is like when we all give, we don't give to Confederate reenactors who deny that it was about slavery, even if they like our position on, something else, because we factor that all in. Very difficult for companies. And that's why I think the disclosure part, I think Bruce Riley and others have pressed on it, because it starts to create an accountability dynamic that's better for the better companies, and that helps the people in companies who honestly would like to get out of this sordid business.
Gotcha. And I think again, back to the first part of our conversation, this lends a new frame to the pain and frustration that executives are feeling in being pressured and being critiqued over and over and over and scrutinized for everything they do, and this feeling that they can't win. And I think what you're saying is, right, you can't win, you need to take bolder steps.
Well, and the way you transition, though, is just like, I have this joke, right? It wasn't, just so you know, nobody cruelly put this up. I was joking. You could say hair club for men. I'm not going to tell you that I have bangs, right? I can tell you I got a haircut a couple of weeks ago. I do what I can, what I did, but I'm not going to tell you I have bangs. I think if you're a company, if you're charting from where you are now to the future, don't pretend to be perfect. Indicate that it's difficult for a company to contend in an environment like this, where, honestly, companies are under pressure by the people who regulate them to give them money, that you tend, therefore, to focus on the people who regulate you, that there's an increased sensitivity, that's really not aligned with all of our stakeholders. And we want to do better. And we have no doubt by trying to do better, and when we expose more information, we're going to learn ways in which we fall short of the mark. That's the journey we're on. But we're not pretending that we just woke up and we're better than anyone. And here's the thing I think the company should also be saying. We want anybody who is respectful to other people in the workplace. And to be able to come to work, whether they are a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or they don't believe in any of those religions, or they have a different religion. If you're a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat, or have a different belief, as long as you come to our workforce and you are collegial, you respect other people's views, and you come together in the common cause of doing right by our customers and seeking to run a good company, you're welcome here. And one of the reasons why we want to leave politics, to human beings is because our customer base and our workforce represent the full range of American values. And that's to be respectful to you. And the basic nature of a republic, it requires us not to take sides and to not misuse the trust that's placed in us for very different reasons, for improper purposes. We have money from our stockholders. We have invested capital from our workers. Many of you have entrusted your careers, made family decisions based on you. We have customers who have relationships with us. And it's because we try to be a good company that makes money the right way. It's not because we expect all of you to share our political views. And we don't want a situation where you feel like you can't work for us because you're not welcome here, because we're actually getting involved in issues that should be legitimately left to our employees and our customers to really express for themselves in the political process. I think it's too lost on people that, calling on corporations, Elizabeth, to do too much is dangerous too. There's an Elizabeth from the University of Michigan named Elizabeth Anderson who writes a book called Private Government. And this is something that that the good Adolf talked about too, Adolf Burley, is, the idea for many of us spend more of our waking hours under our employer's roof than we do with our families. And the idea that within that space there should be an orthodoxy is antithetical to the whole idea of our republic. And so we want corporations, I think, to be responsible citizens, treat their employees right, treat their communities right, treat the environment right. But I think we actually don't want them to be a form of authoritarianism or totalitarianism themselves, where people come to work and feel like they're ostracized. And I actually think if you align your corporate political practices in the way that I said, and you actually focus on being a good corporate citizen in the right way, which is through your own behavior, you actually will much more credibly walk the line. And you'll be under less demand as a business to speak out situationally on things that honestly might be more appropriately the subject for public discussion by human beings who have profoundly different but good faith differences of opinion about something, then that the company that you work for has now expressed that, it's utterly immoral for you, for example, to adhere to your religion in some sort of way, because the company is speaking out. That's, I think, so I think part of what Dorothy and I are saying is by reducing their target zone a bit and being disciplined, you're also actually expanding the real range of freedom for Americans to think for themselves and speak for themselves, because there is such a thing as being drowned out. And I'm going to actually mute my microphone so that I don't do what I fear companies are doing to others.
Thank you so much, Leo, and much appreciated. And I hear this distinction, and I think that's one reason these kinds of conversations are so important. And this idea of guardrails that take it off the table, so you're free to do, as the article says, focus on what counts and allow the debate. So I'd like to turn it now to Jeff Clements and American Promise, who are working on those guardrails and on reducing these issues around first mover problems or the unilateral disarmament. Jeff, you're working on a constitutional amendment, which is something that is bold and decisive. I don't think many business people are quite familiar with the effort or how long it's been going on. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about why focus on an amendment, what it is, and why companies or investors should take it seriously, take it as a serious interest.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks to the Chief Justice. He'll always be Chief Justice to me as a lawyer. I have only gotten used to not rising when I see him on my Zoom screen. So I'm really glad to be here with all of you. Glad the Chief Justice is on our National Business Network supporting American Promise and our constitutional amendment efforts. And I see so many of you, Maureen Klein at Pirelli Tire, who actually a global company who has a policy against political spending of any kind, as other companies do. So a lot more business people are coming into this conversation. We have a strategy. The Chief Justice is quite right. There's not much that's harder in American civic, political, legal, social life than constitutional amendments. We've done 27 of them. Note that 8 of those reversed Supreme Court mistakes. And we are quite confident this is going to be one of those because we have massive consensus around it. So high bar, but so is everything. So I see it, the Chief Justice is exactly right about the two options. I just take out option. We got to do them both. We got to address the corporate governance issues, the corporate law issues. But for many of the reasons that have come up and are in the chat, we can't leave business to solve this ourselves because we can't without a level playing field, without a engagement of society and American citizens around what the rules are. We can't get out of this. I do not think 75% shareholder vote, I'd love it. That's about as hard as a constitutional amendment in these days in many ways. So doing what we know we need to do and focusing on both of those items, I think is what we have to do. So a constitutional amendment first, what is it? It is very simple. It won't provide all the answers to what the policy should be. Fundamentally, what it does is in a paragraph, essentially reverse the disastrous mistakes the Supreme Court has made and empower the people, American people, to make judgments about the boundary lines and the use of money in the political sphere. So that means state legislatures would enact better laws as they had. The Supreme Court has struck down dozens of anti-corruption laws that address corporate and union spending, for that matter, as well as individual spending for over 100 years. Those would come back in different ways in different states and state elections. Federal elections, of course, would address. And again, it's not just corporations. That is a serious problem. But we have foreign government money coming in now through LLCs, something the Supreme Court, as the Chief Justice said, they had not thought this through. And we now have LLCs and C4s and all kinds of front groups with foreign government intelligence operations running money into our elections, wholly owned foreign government corporations spending money. So these are not shareholders other than one government or one sovereign fund coming in. So it's a large problem that needs a constitutional solution, or it just gets worse and worse. So what are we doing about it? 22 states have formally passed resolutions. We are doing state-based work to build the support to get the 2/3 vote in Congress we'll need in a few years, and then ratification in 38 states. Business is key. I was on the phone this morning with the Chamber of Commerce in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We've been having conversations with every single local chamber in Pennsylvania, the state chamber. That's our state ready to ratify model. They are very eager to get this conversation going. We're having conversations with Rotaries. I see Don Bender on the call and very helpful on the Rotary front. So this is not a political partisan thing. This is something Americans want to get done. And the more business people can get involved and help support it, the faster it's going to go. And we'll get this constitutional amendment ratified. So thanks to all of you who have joined. For those who'd like to learn more, we don't have enough time because we are, unlike the court, aware that the First Amendment is a balance and we have to share time so others can speak. I would ask, and I'd introduce John McCree on the call. He can hold up his hand or put his email into the chat. John, and we'll have our emails up. Please reach out. John McCree is a successful career in business himself, joined us running our national business network. And we were co-founded, myself and John Wass, a Staples executive who helped scale Staples. We've got a lot of business focused work to do. So we'd love to have you involved. Reach out and contact contact us. And if you're not already in our business network, we'll help you take any manageable step that you want to take to help move this along. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff. And we will have a call to action at the very end where we put up on the screen what people can do and post additional links in the chat. There's some great resources on the business, ways of thinking about this from a business point of view. And also I want to go to Bill Shireman now. Bill, you're a brave person forming California-Texas Business Alliances, California, San Francisco Republican. So you cross lines a lot, I know this, and you've been working on climate policy and then increasingly on how the current system pushes us into polarization and prevents us from solving very real shared problems where there's consensus. How can that be? And where do you see action? We've had proposals within corporate governance. We have this get to the root of the constitutional amendment and authorizing limits. How can this problem exist, and what action opportunities do you see for business and investors?
Well, I do think there's a tremendous opportunity for citizens to play a role and for investors to play a role. But I want to make a couple of points that will call attention to why that's essential.
Bill, before you get started, Bill, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but there is something going with your microphone. I don't know if you want to adjust the volume or make sure, but you're sounding a little warbly.
I'm going to try to lean in. Is that any better, or is that
slightly better? And we don't want to hold everything up, so let's have you keep going. But yeah, if you lean in, it might help. Yeah, that's better.
I apologize for that. I'll try to be concise, which would be a challenge. So.
Well, we'll have more time with you on May 19th. So
that's right. That's right. Good. Well, as a San Francisco Republican, who gets shot at from both sides, this is an issue that actually unites people, unites voters overwhelmingly. Both Democrats and Republican voters recognize the sinister power of money in politics. But I want to point to two things that are not always obvious to people. First of all, this system is genuinely dangerous to corporations. Even the big, the large institutions, the big corporations, the big unions, the public employee unions, and other institutions that seem to benefit from the pay-to-play political model, it's dangerous to them. And many CEOs and other leaders want to stop it. But they're told, and I've heard these stories over and over again, most recently, a CEO who approached Mitch McConnell and relates the conversation about shifting on carbon pricing as follows. He was told, you stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours. And the message to the CEOs is that you're not in charge of public policy. You go do your business. We will manage tax laws and rules to create a positive business environment so you make lots of money. And you will shift some of your consumer dollars to our political industry, and we will shift some taxpayer dollars to your industry, and that will protect you from the extremists who want to take down corporations and capitalism itself. Corporations, especially the ones that are caught up in this, don't have a choice right now. These political contributions are not voluntary. They are coerced. They're a part of the cost of doing business. And they are also not limited unless you consider the $4.5 trillion annual tax proceeds and spending of Congress to be the limit. There's no cap on these expenditures. They tend to slow innovation in the economy, which is fundamentally bad for business overall, and investors are beginning to realize just how much they're holding us back. And they're actually generating an anti-corporate, anti-capitalist extreme movement, both on the left and the right. Those folks that are attacking the Capitol, on the right, and the folks attacking the banks on the left, they're both upset at what they perceive to be the impact of money in politics. and they're both growing weary of capitalism, or what they perceive to be capitalism. So what do we do about it? In This Together is an initiative of Democrats, Republicans, independents, folks across the aisle. Our operating theory is that people have a lot more power than we think we do. And that if we use that power strategically, we can change these power dynamics. And we can do that in this arena in a couple of different ways. First of all, the business community has a dynamic, a power dynamic. Large corporations depend on major brands and retailers to get their products through manufacturers and to the public. And retailers and consumer brands rely on the public for their dollars. There are many brands and retailers who have stepped up and want to take the lead, help take the lead in solving problems that are right now stuck in our political system. To the extent that we can recruit about a 5% share of the nation's consumers and voters to step into organizations like those that are represented on the screen right now and work positively with retail and consumer brands to drive these changes, those brands have the market capacity to create a market incentive, an imperative, if you will, for companies down the supply chain to get out of politics, particularly on those issues, and to make clear the business imperative that they face to do that to the lawmakers. So that's a leverage point that we can use positively in alliance with many brands and retailers to drive that change. Not everybody's going to want to participate in everything, but they can participate in something. Every brand has some issue that it cares about, that it wants to lead on.
Thank you.
And then in districts as well, a 5% share of the voters in Republican and Democratic Party can create the groundswell of support that can influence the Federalist Society and others, in the conservative legal community to take another look at issues like Citizens United. These are not instant, easy wins, but they are strategic wins that we can have if we take a more strategic approach and look at this with open eyes and a plan.
Thank you, Bill. And I think at the headline level, a bit of what I hear you describing is to get out of the influence, debate, pressure within issues and shift to enabling problem-solving processes and a refocus on reform. I want to, and I know we could talk much further on this, both with you and Jeff, but I'd like to do now, just because I've held off on all the comments and questions and I see the chat going by there, can we take 5 minutes now, and then at the end of the call we will stay on and we can explore further for whoever is available to. Let's take 5 minutes now, if I could turn to Adam and Zach and hear one or two comments that have stood out to you, themes, questions from the chat, and maybe we could focus mostly on this action portion of the conversation.
Right. Yeah, I think the chat's been very robust so far. It's been really great to follow along in there. I think we're seeing a lot of consensus around a conversation kind of going around the responsibility, not just being on companies to solve the problem, but Congress and other players have also been complicit in encouraging the spending. In terms of actions and looking forward, I think a lot of the conversation has centered around how do we balance that? And I think that's the kind of question we'd like to turn over to y'all to discuss.
How do we balance, phrase it as the more complete question, how do we balance which?
How do we balance the fact that beyond companies, there's other players that are also complicit in encouraging political spending?
Great. Can we hear, can I go to you, Leo, just quickly, how would you?
I want to underscore what Bill said. I think behind the scenes, if you look at the polls on restricting corporate political spending, it's one of the few issues where there are super majorities of Americans, of Republicans, independents, and Democrats all against it, and it can't get on the floor. The Bogle bill and I pushed this to members in Congress, I'd love to see that on the floor of the Senate. I'd love to see the filibuster on that. But why does it not get to the floor of the Senate? Ask yourself that. And there are certain business interests, by the way, that don't want these kinds of things because they do rely on the rent seeking. I would say one of the reasons why I have focused on corporate law, besides the fact that Congress is sort of out of the action, except as it helps with the constitutional amendment, or that they'd be willing to put up the BOGO bill, is I've been pushing for index investors to use their voice the entire century. Wasn't smart enough to call them universal owners, but the reason why I said index funds is they actually represent the rational investors. They represent the people who are invested in the whole economy, and they know and they have an influence when they speak their mind. And if we put them on the spot, to be honest, they can shut this down because they really can't reconcile this. And I just want to say that I think Bill made a big point, and I want to say this as a person who has never been scared out of being called a liberal. I have respect for Ronald Reagan, what he did for communism, didn't agree on his domestic votes, but I'm a Franklin Roosevelt liberal, didn't have to hide behind Teddy. That doesn't mean that conservatives should share my view. And I think what Bill said about him is people don't want corporations from the right, want corporations where they feel like if you're a Catholic, like I'm a Catholic, I am personally pro-choice as a matter of public policy. My wife and I, honestly, we think there are better ways to address things, and we're pretty much pro-life, anti-death penalty, pro-whatever. We don't feel so somebody should come to work, and whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, feel like they can't come to work. You know, and we have that view. And I think there's a real problem in our politics right now, and confusing it is people have to earn a living. And when you have corporations being branded one or the other, are we going to have red corporations and blue corporations? And how does that work? And so I think what Bill's spoken is that this doesn't really work well for anybody, and it slows growth. And I think building on that we actually want to leave to the American people the freedom to decide for themselves. We want business to focus on making money the right way, and frankly, which is quality products and services, treating their workers well, treating the environment well, but they leave the politics and religion, they leave it to the people who deserve to discuss those issues and who are entitled to have diverse issues on them, the American people. And so I think we have to press on these institutional investors as a first level. I think it's also a real accountability tool. And I think, though, the outside groups, I think those of you ought to be thinking about, why isn't this coming to the floor? You're telling me you're for this stuff, put it on the floor and vote on it. And by the way, if a business gets spoken to like that, they need to say, Senator Blank, you misunderstand who's constituent, who's the constituent. And I'm the constituent. And we have 10,000 jobs in the United States of America. And you work for our employees, not vice versa, and you will not intimidate us. And I am not afraid to speak about our conversation publicly and to say that I'm supposed to give you money and just let you do what you want. I mean, I honestly think there's some business leaders who wouldn't be treated that way, but it's not wrong that it's intimidating. But sometimes that's why group consensus, and I would focus on things like we have no staggered boards in corporate America basically anymore. That is something that happened over 10 years, basically, bam. You can move the needle on corporate political spending if you focus on the big three investors and on their role. You can move it quickly, and especially because a lot of the companies would actually like it. And so that's one of the, and I'll stop talking. I think that is a real pressure point. And I also think that the big institutional investors, Elizabeth, have been left out of this debate. The companies that make real products and deliver real services and employ most Americans bear all the heat. But the people who have most Americans' capital are the institutions. And it's time that they align their woke talk. And I'm glad they're doing the woke talk. I have encouraged them to talk about climate. They're finally talking about workers. They're finally talking about equality. But if they're enabling corporations to skew the political process and hurt workers and hurt the environment and to not allow the American people themselves to decide these issues, then their woke talk is really not as meaningful as it would be if they would exercise their voting and stewardship policies the way that they should.
Thank you very much. And I think through everything you've said is this question to see the larger pattern, realize what's at stake, and step up to this bigger thinking and solving the root issues. skewing the political system is we're seeing the symptoms of that. I need to have us wrap now, and I'd like to turn it to you, Tom. This is wrapping the formal portion of the conversation. And Tom, can I ask you, as while I have the students put up a poll, if we could have people, we have 2 questions on the poll, and then Tom, leave it to you to moderate our closing section here. I think we've just heard the call to action from Chief Justice Strine, but maybe you could do the closing remarks as you've noticed themes in the call. Well, as people are doing the poll, if you all don't mind.
Sure. So I see the poll. I hope everybody else does. This has been a great conversation, really focusing on that corrosive impact of money in politics. I do think there's a follow-on set of questions that are very closely related about whether companies should stop speaking out publicly. Because one of the things that we as a CPRT have been seeing is companies feeling a lot of public pressure from social movements and from their own employees to take a position on various kinds of important public issues. And so that kind of follows up. I think we'll have to move that into the informal part of the conversation to follow. But that was very striking to me. And I appreciated this summary at the end about the power of institutional investors as a leverage point to actually make something happen rapidly. I think it's wonderful to have a takeaway where we can focus and we can start to identify people like Scott Kalb, who's on the call with us, who've been pressing for that type of action. So I think that's really encouraging. And Jerome, of course, has been working a very similar kind of direction. So it's great that we're getting a charge, if you will, to take away from this call.
Very good. Yeah, and that leads us right into these closing actions. I'm going to read these off and then ask for anybody to correct me if something I've missed. So with Jerome and your work, we've flagged here a few ways people can take that further. Read this excellent report on the Corporate Lobbying Alignment Project and recommendations for investors, for institutional investors, and their scorecard of where, this is a target you all can look at for where institutional investors are now. Include lobbying in your ESG policies, and scrutiny of lobbying alignment will surface the need for these structural reforms, and you can put on there investing in reforms around political spending, and connect ESG with your public affairs folks. Those teams need to be talking to each other. Jeff Clements mentioned the American Promise. There is a national business network within American Promise and a statement of principle around support for this kind of reform. It's quite easy to go in, take a look, see who has signed already, and add your name if it feels aligned for you, or follow on LinkedIn and Twitter, and you see the contact information there, and Adam and Zach will put this in the chat for Jeff Clements and John McCree, who leads the National Business Network. With Bill Shireman and folks at In This Together, I'm very excited. We'll be down at EarthX in Dallas shortly. And the headline on some of their campaigns, which you can see at the website, is to redirect any spending and votes to problem solvers, not polarizers, and processes that involve citizens in those deliberations. They actually work when we talk to each other, as the chief just mentioned, and then go to their website to sign up and learn more and join the pledge. And then lastly, for those of you, and I know we've had folks in the finance industry as well as other industries on the call, to contact us about potential memberships. The timing is perfect. We're in the process of crafting principles on for what basis you engage in the political sphere and how do you distinguish these structural reforms from getting into every debate. And you can sign up on the website to join future dialogues. I think we need to move, Zach or Adam, if you could move the note-taking. I want to be able to point out we have the website for the Center for Political Accountability. They have a new report coming out on business and democracy, and a consistent flow of data, research, and recommendations that you'll find useful. Business for America is doing a campaign on civics secures democracy and other well-vetted campaigns that are nonpartisan on structural reforms. And the Leadership Now Project is a group of MBA and business leaders and thought leaders working on business and democracy. And they're just coming out with some work on ESG and political spending. I think that's it. And Chief Justice, will you be able to stay with us for a couple more minutes?
I prefer to let others step up. I've said my bit, I think, more than my bit.
Well, thank you. And first of all, before you have to take off, I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you for working with this constrained time frame to cover something so important. It really
No, it's
helped
great to
us.
be with people who care so much about our society's best ideals. And I think there's so many great ideas. And I just hope you continue the good fight, because it's really important to bringing our social, knitting our social fabric back together.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to hear that. Okay, let's turn it, Zach and Adam, I'm going to turn it to you for what's coming up in the chat, and maybe bring up another question for us or theme that you're seeing.
Yeah, right. I think I saw a few great questions coming from Scott Kalb for the Chief Justice. If Scott would like to just take himself off mute and ask, I think he had a few great questions that he could do a great job of synthesizing. We can go from there if he's still with us.
Come on in, Scott.
I'm here. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for just a great conversation. And I really appreciated Chief Justice Strine's history and views, and Bill Shireman's thoughts, and Jeff Clemens' thoughts, and Tom's and yours. Just great. So, my problem is that I had a couple of questions for the Chief Justice. And we're dealing with systemic risks here. And one problem is arguments, I agree 100%. What we should be preaching is abstinence, just don't do it. It's not good for you, and it's not good for society, and it's not good for your shareholders. It's not good for your workers. It's not good for your customers. So why would you do this? But the problem about abstinence is, as a policy, I'm not sure how effective it is. It's like telling teenagers, preaching abstinence, sexual abstinence to teenagers, it's the right, maybe it's the right idea, but it just kind of doesn't work. So, I'm not sure that we can rely on moral suasion. I think we need regulation, and currently the regulator is hampered. We have a budget rider in place that prevents the SEC from addressing this. And we had a conversation with SEC Commissioner Allison Heron-Lee, who very frankly spoke about this and said that it does need to be regulated, that they get a huge amount of feedback on the issue, but they need Congress to lift that rider for them to be able to take action. So that's one concern I have. The other one is, we need, why shouldn't we? I like the idea that Chief Justice Strine said we've got to push not just on the companies, but also on the asset allocators or the institutions, the shareholders, to incorporate this into their ESG programs as one of their, main engagement issues. And, I'm interested in efforts on that and his reaction on that point. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And I think we have lost Chief, but I want to turn it to our other speakers, and I think if we could on that one. And I think this question of first mover, unilateral disarmament, preaching, making it based on moral suasion, gets to how do we leverage the political commitment that's there, political will that's there now, and the interests that he spoke about, to create those guardrails. So can I open that up? Maybe Jerome and Jeff Clements, I'm thinking both of you would have opinions on that. So Jerome, the investor perspective, and then Jeff, the guardrails perspective.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and hi, Scott. It's good to see you as always. So there's two things here. One is I entirely agree with the abstinence metaphor, for better or worse. At the same time, I don't think that anyone has the control or agency to organize a sequence of interventions, that says, well, let's first remove the policy and then we, move the investors and so on. There's no we. I mean, we is the 26 people who are still in the conversation now. And I don't know that we have that sort of organizing capacity. And that's why I feel rather strongly that we've got to push all the buttons. And each one of us, all the buttons we can.
I got you. Okay, and it's a systemic, I mean, this is a wicked problem, right? But I want to go to I mean, as I understand it, this is some of the logic behind the amendment. So can I turn to you, Jeff, on this?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Absolutely. And Scott, thanks for your points. And I agree with Jerome, excuse me, and Scott, that we have to push all the buttons. And it won't be 26 people, but we've got 250 million people who are raising their hands saying, we want a constitutional amendment. We want to fix this problem. And so, the sooner we don't think of it, that constitutional fix, which as Chief Justice explained, and I'd be happy to provide more information, we cannot fix this as a societal problem without a constitutional solution. And so the Supreme Court could correct itself. That is not in the cards. So the amendment is the necessary thing. And like a lot of systems problems, the key is enlarge the problem and it gets easier. If we try to only do it within the scope of those within the business community who are aware of, have solutions, and are ready to move, there'll be insufficient power to overcome and get any of the buttons to work. So enlarge the problem, invite the millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who'd like to see it done. So how do we do that? I think the single best thing business people could do is simply say it. We support a constitutional amendment. And no, it's not hard. It is hard, but it's now. It has to be done. And it's not something we're going to save and do in 50 years. We have to do it now. That alone, the only thing kind of blocking this is our own sense that we don't do amendments, or it's hard, or it's, something. As soon as we get over that tipping point of, serious, credible business people and companies saying, we want out, we want a fix to this. We have a lot of solutions ready to go, but we know we can't do it alone. We're asking for the help of American constitutional law and American citizens. We'll get this done. And so I do think that, in some ways it's complicated, like all of this problem, but the simple question of are we constitutionally capable of making rules around the use of money in elections, as every society in the world that's democratic other than ours says, of course we can. Well, that answer has to be yes, and the amendment is how we do it. So that's that's the button I think we shouldn't save for sometime after we do what is perceived as sort of interim steps. We have to, like Jerome said, push all the buttons right now. The simple button for the amendment for many business people is, hey, I don't have to get in the weeds of this. I'm just saying I want it. Let's do it. I support it.
Mm-hmm. And so, and from today's call, I mean, several people have said the current situation is a losing proposition for everyone. Scott, you just summarized, not good for the company, not good for the economy, not good for the universal owners. It's so the question is, I think you're flagging, Jeff. I don't think business people recognize that what they say publicly on this could make a difference. Big difference.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me turn it back now to Adam and Zach, if you have another question there, or we can go to raising hands with those that are left on the call. Oh, and Mark Greer, I'm so glad to see you joining us on this one. It's been some time.
It's been a minute. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Great. Back to you, Zach and Adam.
Yeah, I think there's a great question from before the session regarding citizen actions. And it's just as, what are the 2 to 3 most important things ordinary citizens can do to end corporate political spending? We're looking at shifting the conversation back to citizens. What are actions that we as citizens can take?
And I'll turn that to the group, right? Those working on systems reform.
Well, I just talked, but I'm happy to offer a quick. We have our business network, but American Promise is really about empowering and serving every American who wants to help. And there are a few of our chapter leaders on this call. So you can sign right up at americanpromise.net for anybody, and then you'll be connected with the work, and it's state-based, local, and we have our National Citizen Lobby Day, and there's a whole array of actions from small to increasingly engaged, depending on what people want to do. So the way to plug in is at americanpromise.net.
Great. Thank you very much. And then 2 others, I would I would flag in response to that one. As you sow is really interesting this way. They did some studies of how we are invested that violate our own values. And my husband just took a look at his ESG funds that were supposedly sustainability oriented, and they weren't. So that's one of the most active ways we can do that. Vote your proxies, take a look at where you plug in, ask the question of the universal, the great pension funds, et cetera. Ask them, what are you doing? What Chief Justice Strine is saying, if you look at the chain from me investing in a fund from a narrow menu, being managed by an investment manager, investing in a company, doing political activity, just ask the question, how is that representative? And take advantage, take responsibility for our own investment practices and raise that question. And the last one is In This Together America is on the link is there, and they're working on cross-partisan deliberations on big systemic issues. So they have one around social media and hate called The Social Solution. And there are pledges and ways to get involved and join these, what they call deliberative democracy conversations that they can bring to policymakers, and another on the climate of unity. So in addition to working on the root issue around political spending and the constitutional amendment, these are two other ways you can bring this conversation to bear and act on the things like Scott said about the writer. Act on the things around disclosure and making disclosure mandatory. Those are all other steps, but those three vehicles, I think, from my view, could be helpful. All right, we are 1 minute away from the extended time. Anybody have a final comment? Was this helpful? Was there something that wasn't addressed that we should do in a follow-up or conversations after this call? And feel free, just go off mute, chime in. I'm really curious to hear.
Elizabeth, I was interested to find out more about what Judge Strine meant with the staggered boards. He had mentioned that, how that would affect this conversation.
Okay.
Speaking more on the index funds, and I just want to make a quick comment, which was a lot of what we talked about today were publicly traded companies. I spend a lot of my time with small and mid-sized businesses where largely the president is the owner, or one or two or three people. And they are universally in favor of a constitutional amendment because they don't have the money for government relations committees or lobbyists. And by the way, small and mid-sized companies are the largest employer, I believe, in all of America, depending on the state. But in most states, I think small and mid-sized businesses are the largest employer. So just a little note of encouragement. From all my conversations day in and day out, they are pretty much universally behind this, what we're all doing.
Thank you very much, John. And I will turn the question over in a moment, I think, to Scott. But I do want to mention another avenue for influence is to go for those businesses to go to their chambers of commerce. And I think the rest of us concerned about these systemic issues can simply ask chambers of commerce to do educational and consultation processes with their members. Because right now, there were historically processes where you needed to consult your members to know where you invested politically or whether you invested in this. But now we are not hearing that. And it looks like Tom Lyon had to go. I think he's teaching. Thank you very much. So that is one of the avenues. And I think a great call to action around chambers of commerce is just, have you had a conversation with your members and where do they stand? So that those the voice of business can actually be heard. I mean, this is truly a systemic problem where we're doing things that are not in our interest because of so much momentum. Scott, can you speak to the index funds, the power of index funds, and then if you can, to the staggered boards, and if others have to sign off, once again, thank you so much for joining the conversation, and I hope you'll follow through with the organizations mentioned and with us at the Herb Institute. But Scott.
Yeah, thank you. And I could talk about this stuff all day. I think, and I really thank you and everybody for such a great conversation. Before I talk about the index funds, what I think it's critical. I would like to also highlight, I'm very interested in also something that Chief Justice Strine was mentioning as an option for companies, saying, don't give to you don't have to give to RAGA. You can give to the National Association of Attorneys Generals. And he was giving various examples, and it just occurred to me that it'd be very helpful. One of the problems for companies, I think, here is that they don't have the ability to look through. It's hard for them. They need to look through the organizations they're donating money to. But maybe we could develop sort of alternatives to say, you don't need to do this. You can still, donate, broadly to have your voice heard in a nonpartisan and a non-political way. And it might be valuable to have that kind of fleshed out. I thought that was interesting. In terms of the index funds, yeah, I mean, people don't pay attention to that, but there are there's four large institutions that control, a huge amount, something like $7 trillion each. I'm talking about asset managers of passive investments in indexes. And if we could simply get those institutions, I mean, everybody knows who they are. It's not a secret. But if we could get those institutions to vote their proxies consistently in favor of greater disclosures and, more, better accountability for political spending, then we could solve this problem very quickly, I think. Because companies would be there's an enormous amount of influence there. Right now, they're not doing that. And the problem is they're not looking through, I think, as was described by so many speakers very eloquently, that, companies have to be concerned that if they get involved in this, they're going to be offending somebody in political spending. They can't possibly represent everybody. They just shouldn't do it. And similarly, the asset management community, or many of those index funds, are concerned about offending some of their investors if they get active on this. But really what they should be doing is thinking more broadly that the best way they could represent their investors' interests is to make sure that this is transparent, and that it is not, that donations are less about a political motivation, and spending, and more focused on alignment that sort of makes sense.
Very interesting. And I think it summarizes a bit of what Leo said about shifting to voice rather than spending. And that the transparency is a pressure point for that, and it's very hard to justify not disclosing given what we've talked about. But then that idea of shifting to actual conversations. And Jerome, I see you. I'm just going to add one comment. IBM is a member of our task force, and in talking with their head of global public affairs, he said, when we don't spend in any way, treasury funds, no PAC, restricted on our trade associations, we are forced to have conversations about our ideas, right? What would that do to trust? I know you're laughing, right? It's to actually build relationships. And he literally agreed with, he said the same thing about the spending, is it's an attempt at a shortcut in many cases until you're hooked and you're not able to withdraw. It's a shortcut to a relationship where you haven't really laid the groundwork in terms of having conversations and talking about constituents and the interests. So the process of getting to actual deliberation and getting out of the arms race of spending and these various levers feels like it would get companies off that hot seat. And as Jerome and I talked about before we got on the call, this is something I've personally been concerned about for 20 years and have been talking with people on this call about for 10, I think it is. And I'm really hopeful that companies will think, as you say, more strategically and foundationally about what's needed to get out of this mess. And that's why I was really glad to have the work, on the amendment represented, as well as the addressing polarization and in this together, and your work, Jerome, and our work at the task force. All right, Jerome, last comment, and then we'll.
Could I just jump in? This is Dennis. Could I just jump in? Quick comment.
Jerome, do you mind holding for just a moment?
I don't mind.
Yes.
Thank you, Catherine. I didn't realize you were on the call with us.
Yeah, yes. So one thing that I think is really important not to miss out, which is, okay, you have the status quo. How do you shift the status quo? So Leo is right, Scott is right. Leo's point that, listen, where are these index investors, the big, 3, 4? There's a good reason why they're quiet, why they haven't shifted from their current position. And that's because they're, afraid to, because their clients haven't asked them to. So who are the clients? Well, one of the big client groups is, of course, the asset allocators. And this is Scott's point, wouldn't it be great if the asset allocators started to activate on this? But they also have a very good reason not to shift from the current status quo. And that is because their stakeholders, for example, members of the, let's say, New York State Pension Fund or California CalPERS, et cetera, they haven't asked them to step up and take action. And so in other words, if we want to change the status quo, ultimately we have to come to the end user, in other words, the public, who are the members of the state pension funds, who are clients, with the 401ks and IRAs of the big index investors. And we have to find ways to enable the public to activate their voices and say, this is what we want. And I think it's very unrealistic otherwise to expect the asset allocators to take action, to expect the index investors to take action. And it's important to remember, you can have the most compelling set of arguments, rational basis to shift the status quo. But ultimately, if there isn't the push and pull of the demand of the stakeholders saying, well, we want this, then you're not going to shift that status quo, no matter how compelling the intellectual argument is to compel that. And I think there needs to be a lot more focus on how you galvanize that voice of the public, let's say, and direct it to those places. And that's part of the work that I'm doing, of course, as you know. But that has to be a part. That's where the reality check, I think, needs to come in. That one can model and theorize and argue, but ultimately shifting a status quo is, in a way, an emotional sort of. There has to be an emotional or a storytelling push-pull to it. Otherwise, you don't get past the inertia.
Understood, but also having people recognize where they are players in this system already. So thank you for that. And that's Catherine Venice with the Ethical Capitalism Group, for those of you interested in that. Thank you, Catherine. And then Jerome, wind us up.
Well, three quick things. One is that I really appreciate all the comments about looking beyond financing. Political financing. There are many other dimensions to this, including the trade associations, including sort of the general culture in which business operates, and so on. And in fact, in our recommendations, we covered a lot of that. Although more since financing is in many ways a very idiosyncratic American question. There's two things that I wanted to flag that I think are also important. What do you say, linchpins in English, or big issues?
Leverage points.
Thank you. One is transparency, and the fact that in many ways there's a tension here, which is that the word of policy and policy making strives in ambiguity, right? And so there's a tension here which can only be resolved by external intervention, and that's fundamental. And the other one, which came to mind also, is the power of personal relationships. And when we talk about shifting funding, for example, to from politicized organizations to non-politicized organizations, in practice, there are people in there. There's a guy who is a Republican general attorney or a Democratic one, who needs to tell his buddy from university that he's not going to give him money anymore. And I say he because it's most likely a man. But that's also something where an external intervention can help create a setting by which people are, compelled by external forces, have a reason, a collective backing for making that sort of decision move.
Gotcha. And what kind of external action do you envision doing that?
Well, it's either policy or other ways of setting public expectations. Some of the things that we're doing here and discussing here. So I'm not advocating for something else. I'm just saying that these are important enablers of changing those relationships.
Yeah, I got you. The reason I raise it is that I know a lot of people are thinking, well, ESG reporting will solve this, because we will, and I'm just aware of the amount of organizing effort, right, required to scrutinize and respond and use a blunt instrument to try and change behavior in an antagonistic way. But I'm gonna end there because we are now well over, and I'm 10 minutes late into another call. If you have feedback on the call, if there are things that particularly were interesting or useful to you, we'd love to hear them. You have all the links in the chat for following up with us, and I hope you will either continue what you're working on now, much respect to all of you, and also that this sparked, in my mind, maybe some additional asks, additional focal points for those conversations around getting to systemic solutions. All right, thank you so much.